I am saying is we have legislation in place. Let's lock up the state capturers, the corruptors, the corruptees, and let's throw away the keys.
A warm welcome to you, Black Excellence Network. I am Toby Mshweli. Once again, in the couch, I'm here today. It's a wonderful day, of course. I'm joined by a man here, a chief investigator from IRS, Forensic Investigators, and also a radio show host on High FM, Mr. Chad Thomas. So welcome to Black Excellence Network.
T, thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, sure. It's amazing, guys. I mean, look at it this way now. This man, later on you'll find out who is he and what he does. But I'm looking at what has been happening already in the country. There's a lot of things that it's like getting tongues wagging out there. People, they're talking about politics, business, stuff like that. But today, I mean, I look at our government, not just the government as in the government in its own leg and the funds getting looted and stuff like that. But I want to look at it at the perspective of the impact of corruption and fraud in the country. But now, before we get to there, I think I would like to give you a chance, Mr. Chad, to say, you tell the people, who is Chad?
Yo, T, it depends on who you speak to.
Yeah.
So at least it's coming from the source today. My name is Chad Thomas. I've been involved in South African law enforcement for the past 27 years.
Yeah.
I worked for the state, I worked for some of the major banks, and I've been in the private sector for the past 18 years, conducting what we call independent financial crime investigations. We specialize primarily in investigating fraud, corruption that impacts on small companies and individuals. We call it a catastrophic event. In other words, if a small company or an individual is prejudiced through the actions of fraud or corruption or tender manipulation, their company may close. So it's a catastrophic event. It's a business ending event. And those are the people that we try assist in trying to identify how they were victims of fraud, to try get that case escalated to the correct units within the South African Police or the Hawks to investigate, with the end result that it can go to the National Prosecuting Authority, there can be a prosecution and perhaps financial restitution for the company that lost due to the irregular tender or the fraud or the corruption, and that the employees at least get something back.
But if I may ask, I mean, you worked for the government for quite some time, and then before you went to the private side of it.
That's
what
correct.
pushed you away from there?
Well, you know what, it was the timing. I was in the military, I was permanent force, and we went through the Cadessa period, we went through the first democratic elections in April 1994, and towards the end of 1994, the Defence Force, which was then the South African National Defence Force, of which I was a member, I was in the military police, I was liaising with counterintelligence. The role that we played to ensure that the elections took place, that there was no far right or far left threat within the Defence Force ranks, that threat was neutralized. And you know, it was a natural progression. I then moved into the private sector. I joined Standard Bank Property Fund Managers. Okay. I worked there. In fact, I was based at the infamous Bedford Centre in Bedford View. It was at the height of the cash in transit robberies, 1995, 1996. 1997, I joined BOE. We had a division called Ensure which was part of the old NBS Bank Natal Building Society. NBS ceased to exist along with Boland Bank in the early 2000s, and that's when I went into the private sector.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Now, I'm looking at it this way now. I mean, if you look at the statistics currently, South Africa stands at the top 5 of the most corrupt countries globally. I think you're aware of that. On the top 5. That means when it comes to corruption, fraud, I mean, it's just horrible. What's your take on the status of the country at the moment when it comes to fraud and corruption? What's your take on that?
Firstly, where we sit in terms of world statistics, I don't take that seriously. I'll tell you why. If you look at the different organizations that give country ratings, such as Moody's, etc., there's an agenda to that. And South Africa is always in the top 10, the top 20 when it comes to certain crimes of the worst, because we're one of the countries that are in a developing environment that actually contribute crime statistics. We contribute towards, you know, the understanding of this evil, which is fraud, corruption, etc. So when you look at that study, you won't see a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo contributing accurate statistics. You won't see a country like Zimbabwe contributing accurate statistics. But one just has to look at what happened in Angola the last few weeks. The son of Dos Santos, who was one of the powerful leaders of an African country has been charged for $500 million
that's
in fraud.
Mm.
His sister, Isabel dos Santos, was the richest woman in Africa.
Yeah.
She, next to De Beers, controlled the diamond market. So fraud and corruption is not a uniquely South African problem.
Mm.
We are not in the unique situation that we have fraud and corruption coming out of our ears and other countries don't. The fact remains is we have a free media. We know about it. We talk about it. We report on it. Whereas in other countries, they cover it up. Even in your so-called first world Western countries. You know, you look at 2008. It was 10 years, 2 weeks ago, that the financial economy of the world collapsed thanks to the Lehman Brothers, thanks to the lending criteria in America relating to fixed abodes, etc. That impacted on the whole world. Yet hardly any of those executives in those banks that caused a worldwide financial crisis have been prosecuted.
Yeah.
So I'm very sensitive when it comes to people talking about South Africa being a fraud and corruption mecca. The reality is we've got problems.
Yeah.
The reality is that we do have a fragmented ruling party, we have a fragmented opposition, and we have people who take advantage of that.
But then what do you say about the number of, I think currently we have a number of people, especially in the government, who are being said to be somehow involved in corruption, involved in criminal activities, looting funds. We have people with some others, they get that, there's evidence to say they've done this, they've done that. Like, for an example, I'm just going to call a spade a spade. Look at it at the moment, the ruling party, ANC, like most of the executives, they're in the top 6. We've heard their names being implicated with crime and stuff like that. What does that say for somebody like me? Let's say maybe I'm not that much informed, not say me personally, but for somebody who's not that much informed as to what does it really mean to have somebody being convicted and implicated with wrongdoing. What's your take to see that all the time we get these officials being implicated with criminal activities, people coming forward with evidence that this has happened, so and so in the office has done this? Doesn't that give us maybe some kind of a view to say there is some sort of corruption going on, but somebody's just trying to push it down away from us?
As I said, we can't deny the fact that there's fraud, corruption, tender manipulation in South Africa. The disparity between the haves and the have-nots grows on a daily basis. What one must understand, one must realize, is that if we were living in a junta, if we were living in a dictatorial society, if we did not have a free judiciary, a free media, we would not be hearing about these things. We have functioning Chapter 9 institutions. So the fact that we can point out individuals as being allegedly involved in corruption or tender manipulation or fraud shows that as a young democracy, we are functioning. When one looks at the last local election, everybody thought that if the ANC lost metros, they would not hand over the keys to those respective metros.
Yeah.
They did.
Yeah, they did.
Nelson Mandela Bay was handed over, Johannesburg was handed over, Tshwane was handed over, Cape Town was already in the hands of the opposition. And if you look at this, that is indicative of a functioning democracy.
Okay.
The ANC didn't hold on to power in those particular metros. When one looks at the decisions made by the Constitutional Court, the ANC has upheld those decisions. They haven't tried to question those decisions, which means we have a functioning judiciary.
Okay.
The fact remains is, however, that it is sad when the leadership of Africa's oldest liberation organization gets called into account time and time again, and that there isn't people held accountable. When one looks in Gauteng at the amount of people who died because they were mentally challenged and they were taken out of safekeeping and put into areas and homes that were not competent or capable to look after them, that is disgusting. That nobody's been held accountable for over 100 deaths. That is something that will haunt the ruling party come the 2019 national elections. Because when you don't hold somebody accountable and the most vulnerable and the weakest of our society die as a result of fraud and corruption, then you need to stop alleging and start holding accountable.
That's true, very true. Now, looking at, I think most people, I know this out there, if you go out there, most people, when you speak about the impact that corruption and fraud has in the country, some people will say, okay, it's just the people top there, channeling the money, that's okay, it doesn't affect me that much. What is the severe impact that corruption has had in our country? I mean, I think there are a lot of things that really it has led to, from service delivery, from a lot of things. But what is it that is really, that people should know, that corruption and fraud really kills the country? How much damage is there?
That's a question I'd like to answer in two parts. The first part is it creates a greater disparity between the haves and the have-nots, like I indicated earlier. Never before in South African history have we had such an extreme between a handful of rich and a majority of very poor. That's the first part of my answer. The second part is to give a proper indication of how fraud and corruption affects the man on the street. If a hospital manager or the buyer in a hospital is corrupted by an organization that is selling, for example, diagnostic machines, be it x-ray machines, be it anything along those lines, or that sells medication, and he signs off on orders where they under-deliver on the equipment or on the pharmaceuticals, it means that life-saving drugs like chemotherapy drugs, ARVs, are not rolled out. We're seeing this in KZN at the moment. Chemotherapy is non-existent. Oncology has collapsed in KZN. If you have cancer in KZN at this point in time, you will die.
You'll die,
It's a death sentence because nobody can treat it. And this is a massive problem. So how does the fraud and corruption affect us? Well, if a hospital manager is eating from a supplier, then it means that the delivery that's meant to be passed down to the user, to the South African citizen, to the man on the street, it's not happening. If you do not have the correct diagnostic equipment, the person will die because he's not been diagnosed correctly. If you don't have the correct medication, the person will die. So that is the most simple way to describe it. But remember, the person that is corrupting that hospital official, the hospital official works for the state.
Yes.
The person who's corrupting him works for the private sector. So there's a symbiotic relationship when it comes to corruption. You cannot, as the public sector, be corrupt unless the private sector is involved.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
People concentrate on government.
Ignoring the main perpetrators on the private sector.
Ignoring the fact that it takes two to tango.
No, that makes sense. I mean, but currently now, you are in the private sector, and then we also have the government on the side trying by all means. Like, I mean, when Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, came in, he said that he would like to do all he can to curb the seemingly ever-increasing corruption rate. I mean, so now, do you think the country is currently at the right track, at the right pace to try and win the battle against corruption?
You know, when Radovan Krejcir was in the Seychelles, he was shopping around for a new country because his time in the Seychelles was coming to an end. He spent a lot of money getting a Seychelles passport, and they started taking advantage of him. The president's son, they started thinking, you know what, this is a cash cow. And he realized sooner or later his millions upon millions of euros are going to be depleted. So he started shopping around for another country. And one of the countries he wanted to come to was South Africa. So he asked somebody who is well known in government circles, who happened to be in Seychelles at the time, tell me about your laws. And they said, well, South Africa has got some strict laws. The fact is, there's no implementation of those laws. And that to me is a problem. If you look at our police use primarily the Criminal Procedure Act of 1977 to prosecute offenders. But we have got other wonderful legislation. We've got PRECA, the Prevention and Combat of Corrupt Activities Act of 2004. We've got POCA, the Prevention of Organized Crime Act of 1998, which is based on the American RICO Act. In the last statistical period, less than 10 people were charged in terms of POCA. You can't tell me that syndicate crime does not exist in South Africa. So we've got the legislation in place, but we don't have the infrastructure and in some cases the willpower to enforce that legislation.
Okay, now look at it this way. I just want us to get into this other interesting part of everything. I mean, currently we have the ongoing, much spoken about state capture. Like, there are a lot of definitions around that. Most people are saying their own things. Everybody has a view of it, has a definition of it. What's your definition on the state capture?
The state capture narrative is a very interesting narrative. The state capture narrative is not a new narrative like some people are trying to say. The Guptas were involved in state capture. We can never deny that. But to what extent were they involved? Were they the sole state capturers? Most definitely not. We've had companies over the years that have taken advantage of the situation, both pre-1994 as well as post-1994. State capture is most definitely nothing new. The mining houses and the colonial powers captured South Africa from the 1700s all the way through to 1948. 1948, when the Nats took power, they decided more of a nationalistic route. They weren't going to be beholden to the powers that be external to South Africa, leading up to 1961 when South Africa became a republic. But even after 1961, it continued within the ranks of the National Party. One just needs to look at the Broederbond. The Broederbond was established specifically so that Afrikaans businessmen could benefit. Was there anything wrong with that? Well, let's talk about that. The British had benefited. People talk about name changes today. Well, Voortrekker Hoogte, which is now Tabatshwane, in the time of the British was called Robert Heights. So whenever there's a new group that comes to power, they will take advantage of the status quo, but primarily to empower their people. So the National Party came to power in 1948. They brought a lot of the Afrikaners in the rural areas into the cities. They created massive job infrastructure within the public sector so that they could liberate and empower the Afrikaans people who they believed had been downtrodden by the English-speaking South Africans. Of course, they forgot about the black people, the colored people, the Indian people, but it was all about the Afrikaner at the time. But as that was, you have to acknowledge the fact that the National Party took their people's interest to heart. They created this massive public service so they could employ all these Afrikaners. Come 1994, these Afrikaners start leaving these positions. They take what's called VSPs, voluntary severance packages. Black people start replacing them, which is great. We introduce affirmative action. We introduce broad-based black economic empowerment. We introduce employment equity. But then it stops suddenly. And the job creation ceases. And all of a sudden, you've got organizations in the private sector with political links that are trying to empower themselves and their cliques rather than to empower the people. So where they lost sight of the ball, the Nats never. What the Nats did was despicable in terms of legislating racial segregation during the early 1950s. But what the Nats did for themselves and for their own people was actually quite incredible. They made sure their people were looked after. And this is the biggest problem I have with the current status quo. We've forgotten about the people on the ground. We're not empowering those that need it the most. All we have is figurehead appointments. All we have is fronting. Broad-based economic empowerment should have worked. Employment equity and affirmative action should have worked. Instead, fronting took over. Instead, tender manipulation took over. And instead, the concentration was more on self-enrichment rather than looking after the man on the street.
So we can say that during the transition period from the past years prior to starting to 94 coming up, and before that, when, like you said, that black people started to take over, and then there was a cease of job creation. I mean, so somebody must have been so greedy down there during that period. Just after they came into power, then they started to be greedy, not to look for the interests of the people, but rather to try and beef themselves and enrich themselves. I mean, what exactly is that, or what kind of leadership, maybe I should say, that we need then to try and kill that? Because if I look at the current State Cape Town going thing that happened, looting of funds, I mean, that also alone says a lot about the leadership character of whoever is implicated with that. What kind of leadership do we need in order to try and overcome such situations in the near future?
It's a very tough question. One cannot take away from what the ANC has done for this country. They have built more houses in the RDP program than was built during the apartheid era. They have built clinics. They have built roads. They've built stadia for the World Cup, although they white elephants. But they have contributed towards creating legacy projects. If you look at the highway system, we've got one of the best road networks in the world. We let the ball drop a bit with regards to power. We should have built more power stations in the mid to late 90s, going into the early 2000s. We should have built more dams. We should have taken care of that infrastructure. However, if one looks at what has been given to the have-nots in respect of water, in respect of electricity, in respect of schools, in respect of clinics, in respect of RDP houses. The current government did deliver. The problem is they did not deliver on legacy projects. It doesn't help to give somebody an RDP house to live in, but that person cannot afford water or electricity. They should have been concentrating more on legacy projects to create employment, to encourage employment. It's a sad indictment in South Africa that the second biggest employer after the public sector is now the security industry. It used to be the mining industry. South Africa, the mining industry was the backbone. It's no longer...
It's collapsing at the moment.
It's no longer the employer that it was. The fact that the security industry is the biggest single employer in the private sector is indicative of the problems faced by our country. Now, what happens tomorrow if we solve crime? Say tomorrow, crime did not exist. What would happen to the security industry, which is currently the biggest employer in the private sector? What would happen to all those security officials? South Africa, believe it or not, is surviving because of crime. Crime has resulted in the security sector becoming the biggest job creator. And it grows on a daily basis. My industry, the forensic investigation, forensic audit, and financial crime investigation is growing exponentially. It shouldn't be. It should not be. We should not be getting more instructions every month to investigate fraud, tender manipulation, corruption. We should be seeing manufacturing jobs being created. We should see mining jobs being created. We should see jobs being created as legacy projects. Because if we don't address the culture of unemployment, if we don't address the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about, that the single biggest voting bloc makes up the single biggest demographic in South Africa, which is the youth, and they are unemployed, we are heading down south fast.
Yep. Now, here is another interesting thing. Okay, the state capture, it emerged, started, everybody's talking about it. And then the inquiry comes in now, of which in the inquiry, in my own view, I'm seeing some of the similarities with the, if you remember the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think I'm seeing some similarities with the current state capture inquiry going on, because if you look at the TRC, the purpose that it was intended to serve, I don't think it did achieve it in a way, because there were things that people names were, like surface names were mentioned, but nobody was held accountable. So with the state capture also, it seems like we might be having the same issue whereby we're going to have people implicated with criminal acts, but nobody is going to be taking those people accountable. What is the problem?
The TRC was limited. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, wanted there to be peace, wanted there to be solidarity. He in fact coined the phrase Rainbow Nation. A lot of people thought that Madiba coined the phrase, was actually coined by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was there to try to bring about a forum where people could speak openly about what they had done to harm their fellow South Africans, whether it was white Afrikaans members of the security branch that had tortured black ANC activists or PAC activists or Appler MK or Porco activists, or whether it was Appler, Porco, MK that had targeted soft targets with bombs, etc. It was a reconciliation to try to bring peace amongst the racial groups and amongst the far left and the far right. It never addressed economic transformation, which is a massive issue for me. It never addressed media transformation, which is a massive issue for me. When one looks at the media involvement over the years, one just has to go back to the 1970s to see how the Citizen newspaper was created with an agenda to try to capture English whites to vote for the National Party, which was an Afrikaans party. They were trying to draw them away from the United Party, the Progressive Federal Party, the PFP, and other so-called English parties. When one looks at PASCOR and NASPAS was inland. It supported the Afrikaans verkramptes, in other words, the conservatives, the Bitter-einders. PASCOR was in the Cape. It supported the verligters, the Afrikaners who were more enlightened, who wanted there to be a transformation. So media involvement over the years has had an impact. When one talks about the New Age, when one looks at the ANN7, etc. debacle, one has to ask oneself the question, did they have a narrative? Yes, they did. Were they entitled to a narrative? Well, let's look at American politics. Fox is blatantly pro-Trump.
Yeah.
During the last election, CNN was blatantly pro-Clinton. So if the so-called doyen of first world countries can have a polarized media like America, well, then what the hell's going on here? It's not an issue. Why people had to make it an issue, I don't know. We do not have a truly objective media. We don't have the great fourth estate we like to speak about. What we do have are some phenomenal journalists who work for some phenomenal titles, trying to make a difference, trying to report in very difficult circumstances, just like you've got some incredibly hardworking police officers and government officials trying to make a difference. But it becomes overwhelming for some of these people at times.
So now I'm looking at the inquiry currently. Deputy Justice Zondo is there, Raymond. He's there leading the inquiry. He's the only man there in the forefront. I mean, with considering the data, the amount of information that is going to be exposed in the inquiry, do you think the inquiry will achieve the intended purpose?
Firstly, the parameters of the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture's agenda is limited.
Yeah.
And it concerns me that it's limited to a specific time period and to specific organizations. It doesn't go back far enough. To go back far enough, we would need a Commission of Inquiry of at least 5 years. It would be a heavily budgeted inquiry.
Yeah, no,
we would need excessive funds for that.
Yeah.
But it's necessary because that could form part of what we could refer to as an economic truth and reconciliation. Because we've never had that. And one needs to look at who benefited during the apartheid era, who's still benefiting post-apartheid, what is the relationship between those people, and how far back does the capture go? The fact that the SIEX report does not form part of the state capture investigation or commission of inquiry is of concern to me. We have been pushing for the SIEX report to be investigated thoroughly for many years. Thuli Madonsela undertook to investigate it. She did not investigate it thoroughly enough.
Okay.
That is my opinion.
Yeah.
She was very quick to release a report into the Guptas in her last few months whilst in office, but she'd been sitting on the SIEX report for a number of years. That to me is of concern. We need to be able to understand that state capture does exist. It involves the Guptas, it involves black-owned companies, white-owned companies, Indian-owned companies, Chinese-owned companies. It involves the entire Rainbow Nation. But we cannot pick and choose who we're going to go after. If we are going to investigate state capture, we have to investigate state capture as a whole, or else we are going to be left feeling that things have not been concluded correctly, and we're going to be left with this culture which has permeated each and every sector of society, continuing unabated. We cannot pick on a handful of people. We have to look at the entire problem from a holistic perspective.
Okay, now I want to look at this one thing. Before the inquiry commenced, we had the Hawks declaring publicly several times that they have issued the warrant of arrest on the Guptas, to Zanis and so forth, only to find that in return the legal team of those people, they will say there's no such that has been done, and somehow Hawks also did confirm that, okay, we didn't have that one, but then you wonder, why did they declare such a thing? Now, I want to go back to the fact that you were once in the government's securities, like some of those things in the state security, and then you went privately. What is your take on the current security status of our country's security status? What's really going on there? Because I think there's a lot that is not being done properly there. You have your Hawks, you have your IP, but then I don't think the job is being done properly there somehow. There are a lot of blunders going on there. Is that the reason why you left, or it's just it was a personal choice that, you know what, I need to go?
No, I left. It was natural. It was me time to move on into the private sector.
To rate them, but do you think they're doing
we never had the Hawks or the Scorpions when I was involved with the state in the early to mid 1990s. The Scorpions were created for a specific purpose. They served a specific purpose. However, there were issues relating to cherry picking, there were issues relating to political agendas. The Hawks, on the other hand, I feel very sorry for them. The fact that Nklemeza is gone is the best thing that ever happened to the Hawks.
Okay.
The fact that they've appointed a advocate who is an ex-serving member of the police that worked his way through the ranks, General Godfrey Lebeer, is a positive sign that they are serious about appointing a person who is qualified and ready to do the job. When they appointed General Mokotedi as head of the Gauteng Hawks, the same thing applied. He was the most qualified person for the job. General Matakata, who was the acting head of the Hawks, she is qualified for the job. They are trying under exceptionally difficult circumstances to make a difference. I feel for them every single day because I understand the roadblocks that they encounter. They encounter political agendas. They encounter big business that's protected by one of the fragmented groups within the ruling party. Even the opposition parties have their finger in the pie when it comes to certain organizations, certain companies, and they themselves have political clout because they may have come through the struggle and started another party. They may have split from the ruling party. They may have been involved in opposition politics all the years. But politics makes for strange bedfellows. And I don't think there's any political party in South Africa that can honestly stand up and say, we are corruption free, we are capture free. Because people that capture countries, capture political parties long before they're in power. Okay. Because it's their agenda to get them into power, to attend to the capture. So when the Guptas came along, capture had already started. It was already happening. Long ago. They just jumped onto the bandwagon, and it was their complete and utter arrogance that got them caught out. And to be quite honest with you, I think the other state capturers that have been involved in the play for many, many years, they were like putting their heads down and shaking and saying, can the Guptas please stop it before they draw unnecessary attention to ourselves? And Mashobli also jumped on the bandwagon to get them exposed and identified as being the sole state capturers. But every South African in their heart knows that the Guptas were not the only state capturers. State capture has been around for a long time. It's a worldwide phenomenon. It's going to be around for a long time. That is the reality of it.
Can the battle against corruption and fraud in South Africa be won? Or we can only manage corruption and manage fraud?
You hit the nail on the head. We can never win against fraud and corruption. It's a worldwide phenomenon. It has permeated society and it has permeated every single country in the world. But what we can do, like you so aptly said, is we can manage it. We need to reduce it. We need to start setting examples. We need to use legislation like PRECA, like POCA to our advantage. And we need to throw away the keys once somebody's locked up. In China, if you are accused of corruption that has led to the hurt, demise, or death of the community, you yourself may be sentenced to death.
Yep.
A few years ago in China, there was a massive scandal regarding milk formula for mothers who had just had children. Turned out that milk formula had poison mixed into it, not deliberately, but one of the additives that they used in this counterfeit formula was actually poisonous to the babies. The children died. The executives of that organization were executed. I know it sounds severe, I know it sounds hard. I'm not calling for the death sentence to be brought back to South Africa. I'm not calling for anybody to be put before a firing squad or hung. What I am saying is we have legislation in place. Let's lock up the state capturers, the corruptors, the corruptees, and let's throw away the keys. You must remember that our law does not distinguish between the corruptor and the corruptee. Both are guilty of an offense. Both must sit. Both must learn a lesson.
You just answered my last question because I need to ask, what does the country like South Africa needs to do now? Because we know the problem now. Then going forward, what do we need to do? We have corruption, we have got your fraud going on, but what are the most significant steps that we need to take now going forward?
Our law enforcement agencies must ensure that units which are interagency units like the anti-corruption task team are adequately equipped to fight the scourge of fraud, corruption, tender manipulation. The SIU is an incredible unit as a case in point. The Special Investigating Unit, unfortunately, had its budget slashed and all of its contractors were terminated. They were making a massive difference because they were recovering money. Not only were they investigating and referring their findings to specialized police units, but they were recovering money from the people who stole. So what we need is organizations like SARS, the Financial Intelligence Centre, the Special Investigating Unit, the Hawks, the South African Police Services, SIPS, and any other organisation that is important in the fight against corruption, to form interagency task teams, to build strong cases against the syndicates, and to identify both the private sector and the public sector players, and to prosecute both those players to the fullest extent of the law.
Mr. Thomas, thank you so much for your time, sir.
T, thank you, my mate.
Thank you, bro. Well, that's how we wrap it up here at Black Excellence Network on the couch. It was Chad Thomas, of course. You heard it for yourself, guys. We need this thing, the security status, the security agents, in the country. They need to work hard, do their job. That's it for now. That's how we wrap it up. See you next time.